All right, guys. Today you got back your lab CERs from the seed lab. So go ahead and get those out and let's look at them. No matter how ugly they look, let's go ahead and take a look at those plant CERs that you just got back earlier this class period. All right, so right now, don't worry about the score. What I want you guys to do is focus on the feedback and the comments that you have for your CER. And what I'm going to do is kind of briefly go over the major mistakes people made in their CER and what you guys need to do better for next time. In fact, after this, you guys are going to practice writing your own CER as a group on the lab that we just did with the reactivity of metals. All right, but we'll get there. First, let's take a look at this plant CER. So remember, during the lesson, or during this time that you had to write the CER, I actually gave you the yellow piece of paper that looks just like this, what you see on the screen. It had the information about everything and, the different parts. And down here in the very bottom, we had the CER directions. And honestly, a lot of you could have gotten more points if you had just read the directions in each of these things and did exactly what it said. So let's start with the claim. The claim most people got correct, which is great. It's just an answer to the question, and most people were detailed enough. If you did get any points taken away in your claim, it was because you just said, yes, water affected the plants, but you didn't say how. You didn't say if the water increased the growth or decreased the growth. You just said the word affected and just kind of left it out there. So don't be too vague in your claim. But again, most people did just fine with that. Now let's take a look at the evidence piece. The evidence is where we had more people start getting things wrong. And if you read the directions, it says briefly describe the variable you tested in the experiment and include your observations and results, including your graph. So some of you got some points taken off because you did not briefly describe the variable or what you tested. So even just a simple sentence saying we tested the amount of water and we put 5 milliliters in the control and we put 10 milliliters in for the experimental, even something simple like that would have been suffice to grab those extra points. Now others didn't include the results of your test. So remember, if you have numbers, you need to use them. So a bunch of you might have a comment that says use numbers in your evidence. That means if you have measurements and data, you need to make sure that you put that in your evidence. Don't just say the experimental grew taller. You need to tell me how much taller, or you need to give me the experimental grew 5 centimeters versus the control that only grew 3 centimeters. So we gotta have numbers in your evidence if your lab gathered numbers for its evidence. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Evidence, you need to briefly explain what you did in the lab, very briefly. We're talking 1 to 2 sentences. And then you also need to make sure that you use your numbers from your results in your evidence. All right, last but not least is the reasoning part. Now this is where the majority of people lost points. If you lost points anywhere, you probably lost it in the reasoning. And the number one reason why people lost points was because they never said anything about photosynthesis. Or if you mentioned photosynthesis, it was very briefly in a blurb, and you never described or defined or told me anything about the process of photosynthesis. All right. Now, the reason why it's so important is because your reasoning needs to use a scientific principle in order to explain. You can't just pull things out of thin air. It has to be science. So when you're doing your reasoning, every time you're doing your reasoning, you need to make sure that you're using some kind of scientific principle to explain why. So in this lab, it was the scientific principle of photosynthesis. In fact, if you take a look up here in the very, introduction part, it gave you an entire paragraph with the equation that you could have, written out and everything in that reasoning part. So a bunch of you didn't even put it when you had the information there. So make sure you include the information you need in the reasoning. Okay. Now, once you've defined and described your the photosynthesis, then you need to tie that back to your results in the claim. So if your claim was, yes, more water helped the plant grow taller, then, you would mention that since water is part of the photosynthesis equation or reaction, adding more water makes sense that it would increase the growth of the plant because the plant would be making more glucose to grow. Okay, so tying photosynthesis back in with your claim is key. All right, but again, in your CER, you don't want to just make things up out of thin air. It has to be based in good science. And photosynthesis is definitely what scientists know for sure how plants grow. Okay. So again, please take the comments that you see in or on your paper and learn from them. Use those to help you write a better CER today in your group. All right. Okay, so what you guys are going to do next is we are going to practice writing CERs, because the more you practice, the better you're going to get. All right. And I know you're probably grumbling, oh, CERs, but honestly, guys, they're not going away. They're 20% of your grade. So if it doesn't click now, then it's just going to suffer and hurt your grade throughout the entire semester and year. So let's just, kick in and get this going and, get good at it now so that it doesn't affect your grade, poorly as the semester goes along. All right. So what you guys are going to do is this will be a group one. So you guys are going to write it with your table team. And so just grab a separate sheet of paper, and all of you are going to have a hand in writing this. So I should see however many people in your group, however many names are on that paper, I should see those same handwritings. Okay, so different samples of handwritings on that paper. Not one person is going to write the whole thing. Each of you need to make sure you have a say and write on the paper. All right, so go ahead and turn around and look at the board as I'm explaining this, because I have all of the information, that you need to write your CER on the board. So if you take a look, the question that you guys are going to answer is the same question as the post-lab question number 1 in your reactivity of metals lab. So if you want to grab your notebook and go ahead and turn to the activity section and take a look at the lab that we just did last class, the one with the 3 different metals, magnesium, aluminum, and zinc, and we reacted them with hydrochloric acid. All right, so the very first post-lab question asked the same question that you guys are going to write a CER to, except instead of just having a one-word answer, you're going to write a claim, evidence, and reasoning to tell me why or how you know that metal was the most reactive. So the question is, which metal is the most reactive? So your claim just needs to be one simple sentence that answers that question. So looking at your data, is it the magnesium, the zinc, or the aluminum that was the most reactive? And I'm pretty darn sure for everybody, it is magnesium. So make sure you have magnesium as your answer for that. Now, for the evidence, you can see just like you did with the plant lab, you need to make sure that you first briefly describe what you did in the lab, and second, briefly describe what you saw. So, for example, take a look at the little bullet points underneath evidence. It says write 1 to 2 sentences describing what you did in the lab. So what metals you used, what you reacted them with. All right, so very simple. And then after that, give me 1 to 2 sentences telling me what you saw. So your descriptions of what happened when you mix the two together. You do not need to put in the descriptions of each of the metals by themselves. Because remember, this is a question about reactivity. So you're going to just include the evidence about what happens when the two substances react, when you actually put the metal in the hydrochloric acid. Okay? So make sure you do that for all three metals. And you may be asking why, if it's just magnesium, why can't we just talk about magnesium? Well, it's a good question. The reason why is because the other two are going to give you examples of, or a comparison basically. So the other two are going to give comparison data so that it's really clear that magnesium was the most reactive one because it had the most bubbles or whatever you guys wrote down. All right, but make sure you have evidence for all three metals. Now, in the reasoning part, again, this is where we want to tie it back to a scientific principle and make sure that we use that scientific principle to explain the why behind your claim. All right, so if you take a look at the little bullet points underneath the reasoning, you're going to see the first one says the scientific principle that we're going to use. So if you look back or think back to what we've been talking about the last couple of class periods, we've been talking about patterns on the periodic table, and we've been talking about atomic structure, right? So atomic structure, we really haven't touched anything about reactivity. So that is not the principle we're going to be using. The one that we have talked about reactivity with is patterns on the periodic table. So you'll see there in green on the board, the scientific principle that you guys are going to use is patterns on the periodic table. So that's what we're going to base our reasoning in. Again, so for every CER you write, just take a step back and think, what scientific principles have we just learned about that apply to this question? And for us, that is the patterns on the periodic table. Okay. So the second bullet underneath the bullet point underneath that tells you to write 1 to 2 sentences describing the scientific principle. So something about, how the periodic table is based off of patterns, and one of those patterns is reactivity. And then you can describe the patterns of reactivity. What does reactivity do as it goes down a column? And what does reactivity do as it goes across? And if you don't remember, you should have a summary table in the at the end of the breaking the code simulation that we did right before that CER that I handed out, that fill in the blank CER. Okay, we put down in your notebook a summary of all of the patterns, okay, that went across the period and down a group. So reference that page in your notebook as you're writing your reasoning. All right, so 1 to 2 sentences about the patterns on the periodic table, or the pattern of reactivity on the periodic table. And then that last bullet point is, again, saying 1 to 2 sentences, tying that, stupid cuckoo clock, tying the scientific principle back to your claim. So since you're referencing the periodic table, describe where magnesium is, describe where zinc is on the periodic table, and describe where aluminum is on the periodic table, and tie it back to that pattern for reactivity. Does it reflect the pattern of reactivity? So take 1 to 2 sentences to describe where these metals are on the periodic table, and then how that relates to the pattern of reactivity that we know. Okay, so those are the bullet points that you must have in your CER. So write it together as a group, get together, make sure, double check each other, make sure you've got all of those things in your CER, because all of these things are going to make a great CER. And that's what we need to practice. We need to practice making really good CERs. All right, so you guys are going to have about 20 minutes or so to write this together as a group on a separate sheet of paper. And then you're going to turn it in up front when your group is done. All right, good luck.